Okay, so we are going to go ahead and jump in. So hi and welcome everyone to the first of our webinar series, the basics of backgrounding veterinary and expert insights from across Canada. We're very excited to have you guys here with us tonight. I'm Sydney Fortier and I am the extension coordinator for BCRC. So we'll get into it. Okay, so just some housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A function. We're going to have one big Q&A session at the end once all our presenters are finished. If you do not send them in the Q&A, we will not get to them. And please feel free to enter your questions as they come up. You don't have to wait to the end to submit. For those of you who have friends who have registered but are unable to join, we will be sending a recording link to everyone who registered. So no problem at all. You can watch it at your earliest convenience as soon as we get it out. We also want to encourage you to subscribe to our blog, Beef Research, on our website, beefresearch.ca. We have all kinds of new information, timely information, and then just updates about what the BCRC has been up to. It's a great resource, especially we have a blog post here from last month going over our new combined calculator, which combined our previously backgrounding calculator to a preconditioning and backgrounding calculator. So those can be found on our decision tools tab on our website. And basically just going over our preconditioning and backgrounding calculator, you put in your own information, your own regional data, and you are able to evaluate the net return of a backgrounding or preconditioning program on your farm as opposed to just selling at weaning. And we will get into this calculator a little bit more later in the webinar. We also want to highlight our tool for analyzing feed test results. So this is a handy tool to be able to evaluate how a feed ingredient stacks up based on what class of animal you are feeding and either what stage of production they're at or what your average daily gain goal is. So this isn't a way to balance a ration, but it is a way to identify any problems with a specific feed ingredient. Also, we're very excited to announce that we are actually providing continuing education credits for RVTs in all 10 provinces. We have 3 up for grabs, so there is 1 per webinar, and the webinars that those are available to is the backgrounding, which is this one, the Johne's disease webinar that is coming up in February. Nope, that's going to be March. And then the setting records, which is our February one. And if you have any questions about how to qualify and in order to get your certificate as proof of completion, please contact Dana Parker. Her email is right there. We also want to be able to, because we do have RVTs on with us tonight, we have a tab on our website, tools and resources for veterinary teams. So it just provides all kinds of great resources that are helpful to you and your teams. As well, you can subscribe to our vet newsletter as well, where we have more targeted information that is useful to you and your team. So we have 3 amazing speakers here with us tonight. We're very excited. We have Daniel Pecoskie, Christine Rosser, and Brian Warr. And we want to encourage you to stay connected. We're on Facebook, Twitter, again, subscribe to our blog, and we're also on YouTube where you can find the recordings to past webinars as well as other videos that we've been working on. But without further ado, I will announce our first speaker. So first we have Dr. Daniel Pecoskie. He grew up on a cow-calf operation in Ontario. He completed his veterinary degree at the University of Guelph and now is working for Metzger Veterinary Group. We're very excited to have him with us today. So Daniel, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hello, how are you guys doing tonight? Okay there? Plan to start here. I'm kind of covering kind of the introduction, the background in cattle. I'm mainly looking at the prevention and treatment of bovine respiratory disease in your group. And as Sydney introduced, my name's Daniel. I work out of Linwood, Ontario, just west of Guelph, or just west of Toronto, for those of you not unfamiliar with the area. Working mainly with beef, cow-calf, and feedlot cattle. So moving on. So the objectives of my portion of the webinar tonight, I'm kind of going to, in broad strokes, cover some facets of bovine respiratory disease, including the prevention.
Daniel,
Yep.
could you share your screen?
Oh, is it not shared there?
No, we can't see it right now.
Okay. Is that a bit better there?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Perfect. All righty. Again, just kind of going over my objectives of the webinar here. I'm talking about bovine respiratory disease, kind of looking into the prevention of it from the facet of the producer, like how we can precondition the calves. If you're planning on keeping calves back from your cow-calf. I know in Ontario it's pretty common also for guys to get in 600 weight calves and background them up to 900 pounds themselves. So there's a few other kind of considerations to be made with groups like that. But specifically today, focusing on kind of vaccination as our prevention against disease. What we do to kind of manage cattle. Nutrition in brackets there because it is very important aspect of prevention of disease that some. We'll have that kind of covered a little bit later on today. And then finally, to close out, just kind of going over some basic approaches to treatment. So this is a fairly common diagram that tends to come up when talking about bovine respiratory disease. But basically, when we're talking about that, we're talking about disease or infection of the upper airways and respiratory system, often with a complex interaction between viruses and bacteria. And the most common presentation of that would be pneumonia in our calves. So we often have to consider the interactions between these groups. So oftentimes, the calf, the environment that the calf is in, and the virus or bacteria that tends to be causing disease. So looking at this kind of Venn diagram here on the side, where we see disease is that interaction between calf, agent, and environment. And our goals here are to see in those three overlapping circles what we can do to intervene and promote health in our calves. From the calf side, we have certain things like vaccinations that we can use, the environment, a clean environment, healthy growth of calves. What can we do and the stress that they're exposed to. So like I said, it's a common or a complex disease interaction, and our common viruses involved would be IBR, BVD, parainfluenza, and bovine respiratory syncytial virus. Those are what we're commonly seeing as causing disease in the feedlot itself, but also on farm in growing calves. Common bacteria involved in pneumonia would be the Mannheimia, Pasteurella, Histophilus, stuff like that you might have heard as you've experienced pneumonia in your own groups of cattle. So bovine respiratory disease often associated with periods of stress, and stress is a word thrown around quite a bit. So not limited to, but all including time of weaning, which is probably going to be the biggest one we talk about in terms of background in cattle. That stress that comes from weaning them from the cow, and the decision to feed them on site. Transport maybe less so, especially if you're backgrounding your own cattle. Commingling, mixing groups of cattle, depending on if you have multiple herds on pasture and you're backgrounding groups together. Air quality, certainly in Ontario compared to Western Canada, we tend to have a lot of covered structures, a lot of converted bank barns. Air quality, especially at the level of the calf, usually when we're up standing in a pen, we notice the air quality is not too bad, but certainly if you squat down and get to the level of the calves, how much ammonia is coming up off the ground. Again, talking about pens, like those bank barns can't hold a whole lot of cattle, so sometimes dealing with stocking density in crowded pens can lead to stress that leads to sickness. And then weather, certainly not something that we can control, but things that we can kind of try to reduce the impacts of it as much as we can. And then again, with background in cattle, a lot of calves coming in off of pasture or drinking off the cow, suddenly getting kind of shifted over towards a more solid kind of bunk situation. Just making sure that we're adjusting or getting them ready for that change in feed, that we don't get sick from the nutritional aspect. So for bovine respiratory disease, commonly what you'll see in a group dealing with pneumonia, a wet cough, hacking cough, some would say, increased respiratory rate. Commonly watching the flank of an animal, you can watch them breathe and even time it out on a watch to kind of see that, for a calf, anywhere between 16 and 30 breaths per minute, pretty common. You can really tell when they start to labor to breathe that perhaps disease is a little more progressed at that time. Fever, also a good indicator of active infection. So typically looking temperature-wise between 38 to 39.5, or in Fahrenheit about 100 to 103.5 Fahrenheit. That would be your normal temperature range. So anything beyond that, dealing with infection and trying to identify where that's coming from. In terms of the depth of the breathing, often panting or shallow breathing is a good indicator. Depression, these are dull calves that don't come up to the feed bunk, hanging the head low, droopy ears, outstretched necks. You're trying to lengthen that windpipe so they can get some oxygen into their damaged lungs. Those are usually later stages signs that you'd see. And I threw nasal discharge up there. Certainly in a sick calf, you're going to see that. I think if that's the only sign that you're seeing in a calf that otherwise has good room and fill and is fairly bright, it's not necessarily a sign that we'd pull and treat for on its own, but certainly in addition to a few of these other signs. If you get that kind of cloudy, snotty nose, often indicating perhaps bacterial infection, whereas with a viral infection, you tend to see a lot of clear mucus production. Again, it's not a perfect system by any means, and usually multiple signs in conjunction are what you're going to see in a pneumonia case. So typically following stress, you're going to have cases of pneumonia peak in the first 7 to 10 days. Certainly can see some cases sooner, but that's usually when the bulk of the calves are going to be sick. So just thinking on a practical aspect, in calves that are getting weaned and stressed out, separated from their moms for the first time, usually you can see an incidence of disease pretty soon afterwards, and again, that peak of disease happening about a week later. So kind of a question to us is, what can we do to intervene and prevent and try to reduce the incidence of disease in our background in calves? And kind of just looking again from the whole. So stress puts strain on the immune system. So calves' immune responses can be overwhelmed, and naturally they have some immune responses that helps them to fight off disease on their own. So, not limited to, but like mucus production and coughing, trying to get those pathogens out of the airway. There's kind of non-specific cells that work in the lungs and in the bloodstream to kill bacteria and viruses by identifying them and killing them. Viral infection, tends to dampen down the effects of these natural immune responses. And what can happen is you can get secondary bacterial infection that sets in when the immune system is sort of knocked down. So commonly you see, bacteria like Mannheimia, Pasteurella, Histophilus. Mycoplasma is a big disease of stress as well. You might see swollen joints or ear infections or pneumonia. And any of these can result in a sudden death as well. So with high bacterial load, you can see, without the effects of a virus knocking down the immune system, if there's just a lot of manure from previous animals, high pathogen loads in the water bowls, and that certainly a calf can be overwhelmed and deal with a pneumonia quickly that way. So kind of pivoting off of that, that's kind of a quick overview on bovine respiratory disease, and now what can we do to reduce the incidence of that in our calves, that hopefully, you know, out on pasture in the summer look nice and bright and have good fresh air, that now maybe when we're bringing them into a yard or trying to feed them a little more intensely than they did in the summer, perhaps they're on creep feed, what can we do to reduce incidence? So vaccination is kind of where I'm going to be focusing a little bit today. But weaning, at that time, can we introduce a way to reduce the stress at weaning? It's, you know, we are trying to, you know, pivot them off of being milk fed and pasture fed, and what can we do to reduce the stress at that time? And there's certainly, you could do a whole lecture on low stress weaning methods. You know, they talk about fence line weaning or using alternative methods. So in terms of preconditioning calves, yeah, often that refers to vaccinating, weaning, and adjusting them to a bunk, getting them able to feed. Oftentimes vaccines themselves will bring premiums. A lot of guys are looking for vaccinated calves for sure. Some of these other steps, you know, deworming and bunk adjustment, it's definitely appreciated by the feedlot who's buying them in. But oftentimes the cow-calf guy maybe isn't seeing quite the premiums on his end for that. But what can we do to reduce stress? And then especially again around the time of castration, dehorning, oftentimes better to do that as in younger animals as you can. A lot of times that's done in the fall when calves are brought in off pasture. So what can we do to reduce the stress? So castration, dehorning, making sure we're using pain control like meloxicam, making sure that we're vaccinating with a clostridial vaccine to protect against tetanus, and then so forth. And then at the bottom here, I've thrown on metaphylaxis, which is just basically a long word for treating cattle on arrival to a feed yard. So like I said, in Ontario, some guys are buying in stalker calves and doing a somewhat backgrounding system for getting them up to a 900-pound weight or so. But with the transport and the moving of cattle, and oftentimes mixing of small groups of cattle, for them it might make financial sense to treat everything on arrival with a long-acting antibiotic that's labeled for bovine respiratory disease, just to reduce death loss due to bovine respiratory disease. For the cow-calf guy that's deciding themselves, am I going to be backgrounding my own cattle this year? And they're not leaving the site that they grew up. Perhaps metaphylaxis doesn't play a role in that scenario. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in there. But I think today vaccination again is where we're going to be focusing on what we can do to maximize health of our calves. So again, what are the goals of vaccination? So we're looking to prepare calves for times of stress. And we've kind of outlined several areas, and weaning in particular is going to be a big area of stress for these calves. Reducing susceptibility to infection. So we're trying to get these calves prepared to mount a more specific immune response to certain pathogens that are directly involved in bovine respiratory disease. So whereas they naturally have, you know, mucus production and non-specific cells that will kill bacteria, we're looking to kind of get more specific and have a direct approach to these viruses and bacteria involved. Also, just you know, as you can see, some days you have a healthy calf, and the next day just dull and depressed. It can happen pretty quick. So the third point here is just a faster immune response to BRD pathogens. It's not going to eliminate the need to treat animals by any means, vaccination, but hopefully we're reducing the severity of the effects of the virus or bacteria involved. So that faster immune response is going to come from that more specific immunity that we're developing with the vaccine. A lot of times questions come up about when is appropriate to vaccinate cattle, and it's always the answer is always going to be ideal if we can do it 3 to 4 weeks before the exposure to a stressful event, and that would be probably more so a planned stressful event like weaning, transport, or even something like castration. So again, the when also depends a little bit on what product we're using, and I'll kind of briefly kind of focus a little summary of a modified live virus versus a killed virus vaccine. So usually, yeah, that 3 to 4 weeks would apply to a modified live virus. A killed vaccine could be given at the same time. If you're using a killed program, it would just typically need to be boosted, and then the second shot would happen at the time of weaning or etc. And then what coverage are we looking for in a vaccine? So oftentimes there's 5-way viral vaccines going to give you coverage again against IBR, BVD 1 and 2, parainfluenza, and bovine respiratory syncytial virus. So coverage is pretty standard and going to give you good coverage going into a feed yard or a feeding yard kind of thing. So, and then bacterial coverage, oftentimes those 5-way viral vaccines will come with an extra component called a bacterin on it. Those bacterins will give protection against Mannheimia, Pasteurella, basically by exposing the calves to a non-virulent form of the bacteria to allow them to mount an immune response. And usually when responding to a vaccine, they will be a little bit dull and depressed for a day or two and then bounce back after that. And then also under that bacterial component, we're looking at clostridial vaccines. Clostridium bacteria, it's usually in a 7 or 8-way vaccine, again, giving us coverage against blackleg, which some of the calves might have seen a clostridial vaccine before heading out on pasture. Again, we brought up at the time of castration and dehorning, having a clostridial vaccine on board for tetanus protection. I threw enteritis on there, which is basically a bloody gut or a bloody scour, oftentimes from maybe more so a higher grain ration, stepping them up onto something like that. So maybe more so an issue in a feedlot scenario where you'd get a sudden death from a high level of grain in the ration and overgrowth of bacteria in the gut. But for our purposes here today, certainly the most important 2 vaccines would be a 5-way viral vaccine with bacterial coverage, and then a clostridial vaccine as well. So this is my slide here just to do it's immunology at a very kind of broad strokes here, just comparing a modified live viral vaccine to a killed viral vaccine. And both of them have their places for sure. Comparing them both will kind of stimulate that antibody production. That's more specific immune stimulation that the body will produce antibodies to attack the virus or bacteria that it's infected with. The difference is modified live viral vaccines will also stimulate another arm of the immune system, the cell-mediated immune response, and that's more so kind of generating that longer memory in those attack cells that will remember in the future for longer if they're reinfected with these viruses or bacteria. So typically a modified live viral vaccine will give you very good immunity from a single dose. Now that comes down a little bit to proper usage of a vaccine, proper storage, using a clean syringe. It usually needs to be refrigerated, so keeping it in a cooler up until the point of using it. And giving the proper dosage by the proper route. So if those steps are met, then usually you can get a good immunity from a single dose, especially if it's given several weeks before a stressful event. Killed vaccines also can give a fairly good response. They often, again, like I said, need to be boosted about 2 to 4 weeks later. So it does mean running cattle through an extra time, which sometimes is a little less appreciated by the farmer for sure. Comparing the usage, modified live viral vaccines typically come as a pellet and a liquid that need to be mixed together to form the vaccine. That being said, once it's mixed up, the entire bottle has to be used on the day. It's not one that can be stored for later, unfortunately. So sometimes you end up wasting maybe a few doses, depending on the number of head you're looking to vaccinate. but usually you can get those vaccines in 5, 10, or 50 dose containers, meaning that you can kind of mix and match to meet the number of head you're looking to vaccinate. Killed viral vaccines, if stored properly, can be used again later. Oftentimes they say when piercing the bottle, you might have a limited, once you pierce the bottle, it might be limited how long you can wait. It might not be good a year later kind of thing, but certainly gives you some options. The last line there kind of comparing, I know it says pregnant cows and we're talking about backgrounding, but basically modified live viral vaccines can be used in pregnant cows as long as they're started on a live viral vaccine program, especially if the product is labeled as fetal protection. They have to see 2 doses before they're bred in order to be successfully moved on to a modified live viral vaccine program. So that usually starts with your replacement heifers. Whereas a killed viral vaccine is safe to give to all life stages, meaning you can give it to pregnant cows and calves, and some farmers prefer to use all the same product. That being said, it's definitely more common to see those modified live viral vaccine programs used in starter calves and in the same sense backgrounding calves, definitely providing a good immune response. And then just one point to clarify is that vaccination itself doesn't necessarily equal an immune response in the calf. It's our goal to have a good response in the calf. A lot of farmers will ask me, I did all the steps, I vaccinated my calves as it was said, and I still had to pull and treat a few. So that being said, what the goal of our vaccine program kind of goes back a few slides to that 3 steps here. We're looking to reduce the risk and reduce the effects of bacteria and viruses causing pneumonia. So certainly there's still going to be a few probably that do break with disease depending on if they get overwhelmed from any of those stressors we talked about earlier in the presentation. So a vaccine is going to give you your best bet at reducing incidence of disease, reducing the number of head you pull and the severity of pneumonia that you see in your groups. So kind of moving on from vaccination over to pen management. So, again, vaccination prevention, like we said, very important. But as one of my professors at OVC would say, like poor management will overcome good immunology. Basically meaning that, if they see all the vaccine in the world, if they're living in wet conditions, with drafts, high levels of ammonia, you're going to see disease crop up from time to time. So what can we do to manage our pen environment? Make sure we have lots of clean, dry bedding, especially at the start when they're starting out, making sure that cattle can find the water bowls if they're started that way, or water troughs, depending on the water system. Windbreaks and shelter. Like I said, cattle tend to like the clean, fresh, cool air. Sometimes in Ontario, if they're in under a bank barn, trying to make sure that air quality is nice and good. And then in terms of windbreaks, reducing the level of drafts as much as we can, while still maintaining that air flow to keep air moving through the facility. And stocking density for sure. Just making sure everything has room to come up to the bunk, making sure that we meet the certain requirements of space for lying down, that they're not all on top of one another, breathing in each other's spaces as much as possible. And from there, we'll move into kind of managing pens in terms of pen checking. So we've started off calves, they've been pre-vaccinated and prepared, they've been weaned, they're started on a ration in the pen. And we're starting to see some signs of respiratory disease. What's an efficient and kind of repetitive way that we can get about that and make sure that we're checking cattle as we go and able to identifying those sick calves early, that we can get a treatment on board and hopefully catch them on the first treatment, that they don't relapse. So it starts with routine checks, which a lot of times are often centered around feeding times. Out this way, guys will see who's coming up to the bunk. But I like to recommend, starting with that kind of group inspection, either from a walkway or just over the fence. Just a chance to look at the entire group undisturbed. So sometimes that involves, seeing who's coming up at feeding, who's hanging back towards the back, and showing signs of depression, head hanging down, puffing, other signs like that. And then once you get into the pen, kind of keeping some things in mind. Cattle are traditionally out there, in historical events, they're prey animals, so they don't tend to like to be rushed or approached in an aggressive manner. So usually kind of working with them and understanding their behavior of how can we move with them to understand how what animals are showing signs of illness, and easily separate and segregate those animals for treatment. So usually kind of starting by walking the perimeter of the pen, you can follow the paths that they generate in the pen, and kind of make sure you're getting animals to stand up that are unwilling to get up, because usually an animal will jump right up when you get in the pen, and if you have those kind of lagging or draggy animals, making sure that they get booted up, and just to make sure that they're looking bright, or at least watching them walk away. So my next slide here, actually, you might have seen a few of these before, but or heard the term flight zone, and it's just sort of a method that pen checkers use, the natural flight zone of a cattle beast to get them up, get them walking, assess their gait, and assess them going. So as we know, cattle tend to move away when you walk towards them, and usually there's that tipping point. If you do get in front of their shoulder, they'll tend to stop. So that's just basically what this diagram is depicting. So usually for walking or assessing cattle in a pen, kind of standing in behind where that black triangle is, getting a cow up and moving and walking. Typically, it's common for a healthy animal to walk away, and when they get far enough ahead of you, they'll probably take a look back just to see that you're not still following them. Occasionally something to watch out for in a sick animal is that they won't do that kind of check back. They'll probably just keep slowly moving forward, just continuing, trying to blend in with the herd, but also just trying to move away from you, who they perceive as a bit of a threat. Again, assessing that gait as they walk away. A healthy calf should have their head held up, supporting their weight fairly nice, but any sort of trembling or weakness or just overall slow movement is a good indication you're dealing with a sick animal that needs to be pulled and taken to the chute and have a temperature taken, and perhaps kind of carrying out some of the protocols you might come up with your herd veterinarian. And again, yeah, that behavior, like I said, dull, depressed, hanging their head down, good indication you have a poor doing animal. And again, just being directly behind the cow, they're probably not going to notice, there's a bit of a blind spot there just with their eyesight there. But yeah, trying to get them to move forward, just using that flight zone that we know how cattle move, kind of walking in behind them. Again, once we getting up to that shoulder, usually they will end up stopping, changing direction. So kind of the last point I wanted to touch on today for bovine respiratory disease in our background in cattle is treatment or intervention, or what our options are, certainly. So oftentimes in these sick cattle, once we've identified them in the pen, usually it's good to have a protocol of a first line drug to use when you pull the first time. If a calf ever relapses and breaks with pneumonia again, what's our second line option? And discussing these options with a veterinarian, not only from a price point, but from an effective antibiotic point. So we kind of covered some of the signs of respiratory disease in calves, and the temperature kind of cutoffs. Certainly some guys would say 103.5 Fahrenheit. 104 is a fairly common cutoff for fever, and if that fever is associated with pneumonia, particularly in signs like a droopy head, cough, etc., then we'll have to move to our antibiotic choice. And commonly, florfenicol, enrofloxacin, or anything in that family of antibiotics are probably our two most common drugs for first line or second line pulls. I've also included there telithromycin and tilmycosin. Those are commonly kind of used, like I said before, in that metaphylaxis or group treatment, and not as commonly for initial treatment. However, those top four bracketed drugs there, They do have a bovine respiratory disease label claim. So they are labeled for use for treatment of pneumonia associated with shipping fever or bovine respiratory disease. As we move down the list, we've kind of got more so, third line pulls, anything that's relapsed. Hopefully in our backgrounded vaccinated calves, we're not getting to this stage. And if we are having to treat, they're going to respond to our first line treatments. But products like ceftiofur, oxytetracycline are common drugs we also use for treatment of pneumonia. And again, bringing up the fever aspect, oftentimes in addition to the antibiotic, we'll use an anti-inflammatory. Some guys will use the meloxicam for that long-acting approach, and they might have it on hand already if they're using it for castration and dehorning. Flunixin is a common anti-inflammatory as well, known for bringing fever down and improving appetites. Then we move below flunixin there, we have isoflupridone and dexamethasone are steroids. And certainly with wet lungs and coughing calves with a lot of fluid involved, those steroids can be pretty nice to relieve some of that inflammation off the chest. Again, kind of used in conjunction with an antibiotic, and they can be pretty good options for us. And again, with working with your veterinarian, as always, keeping great records are it's invaluable. Some guys will, for treated calves, end up putting tags on. I think having a written or recorded record in this day and age is definitely invaluable for noticing trends or keeping track of withdrawals. Again, not so much of a huge concern on the backgrounding side, even with the long withdrawals of something like florfenicol. You're going to be feeding them probably longer than 60 days, perhaps even. So, but just having those records on hand, that if you are having issues, your vet's able to kind of look at what you've done so far and make recommendations. In the worst case scenario, if you are having issues to the point where you do have sudden deaths in cattle, I'd have to say, postmortems are invaluable in terms of giving information to yourself as a producer and just allowing the veterinarian to direct treatment and make changes as needed. Certainly sudden deaths would be the biggest worry, whether that be from something like blackleg or an acute pneumonia causing a bacterial infection in the blood. But yeah, taking the time to kind of work up those cases at the very least. We can also take culture from tissues of the lung to assess, did the bacteria respond to the antibiotics we're using, or did it die before treatment with antibiotics? Was it an animal we missed? And what antibiotics would the bug affecting the lungs be sensitive to if it's bacterial in nature? Certainly we can identify lungs and see, does it look more of a viral presentation or bacterial or mixed, and how acute or suddenly did it happen? So we can get a lot of information that way. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I thank you all for listening. I thank BCRC for having me out here tonight. Again, questions will, I guess, come here at the end of the presentation, but you can input them in the question and answer icon here throughout the presentations. But that brings my portion of our presentation to an end. So I'll stop my screen share here and pass it back to Sydney.
Thanks, Danielle. That was great. So I am going to announce our next speaker. I'm just going to pull up her picture here. So our next speaker is Christine Rosser. Christine grew up on a cow-calf operation before pursuing a degree in animal science and a Master of Science in the same at the University of Saskatchewan, followed by a PhD through the University of Alberta. This led her to working on greenhouse gas mitigation strategies at the Lethbridge Research and Development Center, and now as a ruminant nutritionist at Coaldale Vet Clinic. So please join me in welcoming Christine Rosser.
Perfect, thanks, Sydney. So today I'm just going to focus pretty simply on just going through the basics of what is the nutrition we need to follow, and maybe a couple of points on performance as well. So hopefully you can all see and hear. So today I'm just going to go through a background, just quickly go through everything, nutrition, different potential feed sources that could work on your operation. Some considerations that there's always general rules of thumb, but there's always some kind of tweaks for your own personal operation, as well as quickly touch on some growth promotants that might work for your operation. So what's your overall goal? Well, we want to take calf away from the mama, and we really want to take that calf and grow its frame. And when we're focusing on the frame, we really want to make sure we are building both the skeleton and the muscle. So skeleton focusing on calcium levels, muscle focusing on protein. We can have the prettiest house on the block, but if you don't have a good frame, it's going to blow over in your first wind. So we really need to focus on making that frame. Another thing we need to focus on is trying to prevent butterballing. So basically that's just getting that extra layer of fat around the outside of the animal. And that happens if there's a bit too much energy in the diet rather than protein. So they're putting more fat down rather than the skeleton and muscle. And it's really important to focus on preventing that butterballing, because once we get to a finishing stage, if that calf did have a bit of butterballing during the backgrounding period, it can actually reduce your carcass weight at the end. So 2 important points to keep in mind. And while doing this, we really want to focus on low-cost gains. Building the skeleton and the muscles on this calf are actually going to be the cheapest portion of the growth in this calf's life. So what's going to control growth? Well, we know genetics plays a huge role in how that growth curve is going to happen throughout that calf's life. Different breeds are obviously going to have different frame sizes. But additionally, the genetics of mom and the bull and the cow are going to play a huge role in how their performance is, how much their average daily gain potential is, how much that feed efficiency could potentially be. Are they going to tend towards marbling or not as well? Second thing that's going to control growth is the environment that calf is in. So as Daniel already touched on, the environment's going to play a huge impact on health, but it also plays a role on performance of that animal as well, and determines where that energy that they're getting fed is going to go. Is it going to go towards maintaining that body, or is it going to go towards growing the frame? And we want to focus on growing the frame. And then obviously nutrition plays a really big part in how that animal is going to grow. So we'll go into a bit more details on that. So looking at what's going to impact your nutrient requirements, it's really going to tie in with what are your goals as a producer. So we know as a producer, you're going to probably have an idea of what their in weights are, what your goal out weight is, and approximately how many days on feed you'd like them. That will help you decide what your average daily gain should be on those animals. And based on that, that's going to impact nutrient requirements and your ration formulation that they're going to be fed, looking at both the protein, energy, and minerals required for that animal's growth. So stepping back a bit and talking about nutrition, we know that cows are ruminants, which are the coolest animals in the world, obviously very biased opinion, but the rumen is going to be where that feed enters. So the cow or calf's going to get up to the bunk, it's going to eat feed, it's going to chew the feed, and at the same time, when it's chewing, it's going to be breaking down that particle size, making it smaller, and also covering that feed in saliva. And the saliva is awesome because it helps buffer against acids in the rumen, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. So once that feed's swallowed, it goes into the reticular rumen. And that's where that feed is going to sit and ferment. And it could be sitting in there fermenting for either anywhere from 1 to 3 days of time, depending on how digestible that feed is. While it's in there, it's going to be, the rumen's going to be contracting. So what that means is basically the rumen's like a big mixer. And as it's mixing, the larger particles in the rumen are going to basically mat together and form a bolus, which will go into the get caught in the reticulum. And basically that calf's gonna puke it up and do what we call chew their cud, meaning that they're gonna throw it up, it's gonna go in their mouth, and then they're gonna chew it again. So that's gonna help, one, break down the particles a bit more. And then also it's gonna create more saliva. That saliva, again, is going to help buffer the rumen acids. Once those particles in the rumen get small enough, they're going to be able to leave the rumen through the omasal orifice, which is at the bottom of the rumen connected to the omasum. And then the omasum's job is basically just to pull water out of that digesta and put it back into the rumen. And it'll only allow the feed particles that are actually going to be digested to go further into the abomasum, where it's going to be the true stomach, which is similar to ours, followed by the small intestines and large intestines, where the feed will be further digested and absorbed, nutrients absorbed. So talking a bit more about the rumen. Huge anaerobic fermentation vat, which is filled with a bunch of rumen microbes. This includes bacteria, protozoa, and fungi. And basically what we're doing is we're not feeding the cow, we're feeding the cow, which is going to feed the microbes. And those microbes are going to ferment that feed and turn it into a high energy source that's available for the cows, as well as produce microbial protein through reproduction. So we need to make sure that when we are switching from high forage rations to high grain rations, we really need to keep in mind that there's different microbial populations present within that are going to be in charge of digesting those two different fractions. So when we want to change rations, we need to make sure that we adapt them slowly, giving those microbial populations time to develop and grow and get to their full potential before we change them again and again on the next ration. So making sure that we give them time and everything we do is consistent is going to be the key when we start talking about feeding ruminants. Slow and steady wins the race. So some potential feed sources include, mainly it's going to be forages in a backgrounding ration. So a couple of options that are typically used would be hay, which is a dry preserved forage. That could be either a grass or legume base. Silages, which are fermented forages. So generally they're going to be a little wetter, around that 35% dry matter compared to like an 85% dry matter on a hay. And generally they're either small grains or corn, depending on the year, such as this. It can include other options as well. And then straw or other cereal production byproducts. And then concentrates. So while forages are there to help fill up the animal, the concentrates are there in order to fill in the gaps of anywhere that the forages miss, whether that's energy or protein requirements for that desired average daily gain. So this could be grains, which could include anything from barley, corn, oats, rye, triticale, pulses. The list goes on and on for the different potential grains that can be used. Or byproducts. So a couple of typical byproducts that have been used in the past are dry distiller grains or grains creating pellets. Those are two relatively common byproducts that have been used during the backgrounding phase. There are many different options. These are just the typical ones. So the important thing is to feed test. I know we say they are what they are, but there can be quite a bit of variation within those feed sources. So it's always important to get a feed test. Also, consult with either a nutritionist, a livestock specialist, or a veterinarian regarding the use of novel ingredients and how they might fit into your operation. Also, check out reputable websites if you want more information about alternative feed sources or the typical feed sources if you want more information. The last component of your ration, or what you're going to feed to these backgrounding animals, is generally going to be a mineral vitamin supplement. And these are just going to provide adequate minerals and vitamins for that required growth that you set at the start of the backgrounding period. And really, we want to, one, aim on maintaining their health, as well as at providing enough adequate nutrients for their growth. So we're backing up, we are focusing on building their frame, looking at, so calcium supplements are very important, ensuring that we have the proper calcium phosphorus ratios to ensure that there's the proper development of the bone in that animal. And the level of calcium in your supplement is going to depend on the amount of grain that's in your ration, the amount of growth that you want from those calves, as well as the inclusion level in your ration. So a couple of considerations to always think about in the back of your head. When you're starting calves, there's two types of animals. There's some that don't care that they're missing mom. They go straight to the bunk, love it, happy as can be. And then there's the other ones that are in the back corner. They're sitting there crying. They don't care what you put in front of them. They're just mad. So there's lots of changes going on those first couple of days when you're starting those calves. One, they might be missing mom if they haven't been weaned previously. Two, water. Maybe they've never seen a water bowl before. Maybe they only got their water from a dugout. So they might not know where to get water from. They're at a different lunch table. So we need to try and teach them, where is their new lunch table going to be at? Where do they go to get their feed? Like most kids, some of them can be very picky, and you need to encourage them to eat what you would like them to eat. And sometimes that takes time, and sometimes that takes a lot of encouragement. And then calves are like all other kids. They're going to do what the cool kids are doing, right? So if you can get a couple of calves up to the bunk or up to the water bowl, you're going to get a couple more coming each day. So some things that can help when you're starting calves, or if you know any of the history on these calves coming in. Are they your own calves that you're backgrounding from in your own operation? Are you buying them in Ranch Direct? Or are they coming from an auction mart? All of this can play a role in how you can start those calves, as well as the geographical area those calves came from. A couple of things you can keep in mind, like, did those calves come in off of adequate pastures with good quality water available? Or were they coming in off of poor quality grass, very low energy status, or poor water quality? Because that can impact their energy and mineral status on that calf, as well as their subsequent health going forward. And then a huge question is, how long were they on the truck? Generally, most producers will know how long they're on the truck. The length of time will have a direct impact on how dehydrated or empty their guts are, as well as how stressed those animals could be. The longer they're on the truck, the less access they have to feed and water, and the harder it's going to be to get those calves going. So first things first, when you receive these new babies, we need to make sure they have easy access to clean, fresh water. As I said, the rumen is an aqueous environment where the water and feed are mixing. And if you don't have water, it's basically those calves are gonna feel like they have a big rock in their gut, and they're not gonna wanna eat because they just feel kind of crappy. Water bowls, we need to make sure that they can reach them, that they aren't made for cows, and those little necks can't reach up there. Have they had any previous experience with water bowls? If not, you might need to splash some water around. Some guys will take the floats out or increase the height of the float so the water dribbles out to try and pull those calves so they know this is where water is. And keep in mind that if they are not drinking, they will not eat. So next thing to focus on is feed. So first thing first, what are they used to before? Generally, they're probably coming in off of pasture, so they're probably more used to grass. As such, it'd be a good idea to provide them with some good quality hay, kind of give them that taste of home, a bit of comfort. So whether that's bale feeders in the pen to reduce waste or hay in the bunk to encourage those calves to say, this is where your new lunch table is. But always remember, we need to get them to the bunk eventually. So some of those calves have either never seen a bunk before, or they might not have even seen a total mixed ration. And that kind of plays a role with the next slide. But we want to get their intakes up to about 2% of their body weight within 7 to 10 days. And the reason we say to, or suggest to kind of aim for that 2% of body weight is because that's with the general receiving ration, it takes about 2% of their body weight to meet their maintenance requirements so that they're not pulling energy or protein or minerals out of their body to reutilize. So we want to make sure we give them everything they can use. So one question that always comes up is whether to include silage in the TMR. Do you start off with it in your receiving TMR, or do you wait a couple days, or do you use it at all? Personally, I really like silage in the TMR. It helps bring some moisture to it, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind. It is a fermented forage, and if you're kind of strange like me, you probably have tasted it before, but at least you know the smell of it if you are not weird like me. And as you know, it's kind of got a bit of a tang. And for some of those fall calves that haven't seen silage before, you need to make sure we can kind of get them used to it. I always kind of compare it to, it's like giving a pickle to a baby. The first taste, they might just hate it. So we need to almost trick them in a way to encourage them to realize that silage is really good. So 3 main options for introducing silage in a TMR. 1, you just put a silage-based TMR in the bunk and hay and feeders, and survival of the fittest. Whoever can go to the bunk will go to the bunk. And then once the hay's out of the feeder, you hope that they're going to follow the ones that were staying at the feeders are going to move over to the bunk with the rest of the cool kids. You can have a silage and hay in your receiving TMR that's fed in the bunk. So they have a taste of home with the hay in their TMR, and then they have something new with their silage as well. And then the third option is what I like to call a switch and bait. So that's feeding long stem hay either at the bottom or top of the bunk, I don't care, and then a silage-based TMR on it as well. If you put the long stem hay down first and then the silage-based TMR on top, that silage is going to trickle through the hay, and those calves are going to remember, oh yeah, I know hay, I like hay. They'll go up to the bunk to start eating the hay, but then like switching out a pickle or their food for the pickle, they'll eventually start to eat the pickle. So there's 2 main different feeding strategies that guys will use during a backgrounding operation. That's either limit fed, so that's those calves are on a diet, so the ration is formulated to meet the specific average daily gain when they're fed X many pounds a day per this amount of body weight. Or the other option is ad libs. So that's like the all-you-can-eat buffet. You go up to the table, you can eat all you want. There's a couple different considerations no matter which strategy you use. So if you're limit fed, the positive is you know where your desired average daily gain should be, and you should be pretty close to hitting it. Some negatives associated with it though, is that there can be quite a bit of aggression at the bunk where those calves are hitting that bunk really hard, eating very quickly to try and get their fill. Additionally, there can also be some potential for more differences in calf performance within a pen between timid calves and more aggressive calves, because those aggressive calves are generally going to eat more than the timid calves. Looking at ad libs, so like all you can eat buffet, the positive is that those calves are always full, they're not hungry, so they hopefully won't be hitting the bunk quite as hard or eating quite as aggressively. And then theoretically, you should have more uniform growth across the pen because there's no calves that are going to be eating more or less than their neighbors. Some negatives though are that we need to make sure their bunk calls are where we want them to be. And generally you're feeding a lower energy density ration in order to give them all they can eat without having as much performance out of them. So as a result, you're generally going to have a reduced feed efficiency, so they're going to eat a lot more to get that amount of gain. So with both strategies, one thing to keep in mind is bunk density, especially with those limit fed calves. We need to make sure that there's enough bunk available that all of those calves can get up at a time. Otherwise, those timid calves are not going to perform as well as the more aggressive calves. If possible, try and feed at least 2 passes a day. This will help encourage those calves to come up to the bunk and eat, which is what we want, especially in the beginning when you're starting those calves. And remember, consistency is key. So whether that's timing of feeding during the day, the mix on that ration, and trying to keep the amount of feed in front of them as consistent as possible. If we do need to increase the amount of feed they're getting, we want to do it as slowly as possible, so we don't just have them at extra 5 pounds of feed the next day, and then those rumen microbes are going crazy because there's that much extra energy available. Depending on your desired gains, more than one ration is going to have to be fed throughout the backgrounding period. And with that, when you're changing rations, just a couple of rules of thumb. If possible, ensure there's enough time for those animals, and particularly the rumen microbes, to adapt. So at least 4 or 5 days between ration on a minimum. We also want to make sure that if we do change rations, it's a good idea to slightly drop back the amount of feed those calves are getting, because there's going to be a bit more extra energy in the ration, and we really want to avoid any overload situations. If possible, avoid changing rations on stormy days. We know stormy days can impact feed intakes, whether they're going up or down, and we really want to try and keep that rumen as consistent as possible. If feeding 2 or more times a day, change the ration on the second or last pass of the day so that they don't quite have as sharp of a jump in the amount of energy they're being provided. So a couple things to keep in mind. I don't know about you, but my conversations with cows are generally pretty one-sided. I might have to get this book to learn how to speak cow, but a couple things you can learn from them. So one question I always ask is, are they chewing their cud? So if they're chewing their cud, that's going to tell us a couple things. One, are they comfortable? If they're not comfortable, if they're stressed out, they're not going to chew their cud. 2, it can give you an indication of their health status. If they're not feeling good, they're probably not going to chew their cud as much. And then 3, it's going to give you an indication of how their gut's doing. If their rumen is not moving that feed around, you're not going to get those large particles stuck together, meaning they're not going to puke their food up and chew their cud. Another question I always ask is, how does the manure look? Is it too runny? Is it too thick? Is there lots of forage or fiber coming through in that manure? Or is there lots of whole grain coming through? That can play a really big role in the amount of energy those calves are getting or not getting compared to what it's formulated to be. And then final thing, make sure to keep your goals in mind. So one thing that can help if you do have a scale at your yard is to try and do catch weights. So this helps you make sure that you're hitting your targets for where you want your average daily gain to be. We know that the environment and health status of those calves are going to play a huge role in the amount of growth that's actually going on. And it's always easier to catch those calves up at the back end of your backgrounding period rather than to slow them down. Final note on just some considerations regarding when calves are weaned during a drought, as this might be impacting some producers this year. One, the herd is probably grazing that pasture a little harder than normal, and meaning that those cows might be grazing a little closer to the ground than they normally would. It's a pretty, I would highly recommend the use of a coccidiostat in your supplement, which will help get some of those parasites under control rather than letting it go amok in that pen once they're there. They're already stressed out, so let's try and reduce the stress as much as we can. Additionally, like the mineral and vitamin status of those calves are going to be impacted by that drought. So whether they were supplemented with minerals and vitamins on pasture, because we know that the vitamin status of that grass is probably not as good as we would normally see. And then what is the water quality like on that pasture? Was it good quality, or were there any sulfates in there that might have negatively impacted mineral absorption, which might therefore reduce mineral status in those calves? And then a quick note on growth promotants. So the goal of growth promotants are to increase your growth and improve your feed efficiency. There are three main types of promotants used in beef production. Antimicrobial feed additives. So for today, I'm going to just focus on ionophores, as well as hormonal implants. Beta agonists are another option, but not for use in the backgrounding operation. So talking about ionophores, they are antimicrobials of low importance for human medicine that can be supplemented in cattle ration. The two main ones that are typically used are monensin or lazolicid. And these ionophores, once they're fed, they influence the type of microbial populations that are present in the rumen, which will help encourage a more energetically favorable fermentation. As a result, it's going to, one, reduce your risk of bloat. Two, it can potentially reduce your methane production. And overall, it's going to improve the feed efficiency of those calves. So when feed stuff is a little on the tight side, it's probably a good idea to try and improve your feed efficiency any way possible. Additionally, these ionophores are also can be considered a coccidiostat, so helping prevent coccidiosis. Talking about hormonal implants, these are pellets which can be implanted into the ear, and then the hormones are slowly released into the circulation. Once in circulation, these hormones are going to help encourage muscle deposition, which is generally a more favorable energetically favorable compared to fat deposition. Additionally, they will also increase the rate of growth to a greater extent than their increase in intake. So both growth and intake will go up, but growth will increase at a higher rate, meaning that your feed efficiency is going to go up as well, or improve, so drop your feed efficiency. There are different types and combinations of hormonal implants available. Generally, there's two different types, estrogenic and androgenic. And then optimal implant strategies are very complicated, and they are going to depend both on your production goals and your operation. I would highly, or as a general rule of thumb, use either low or moderate dose implants for backgrounding animals, because we usually want to avoid going backwards on terms of doses. And we need to ensure that if we are using hormonal implants, we need to ensure that there is adequate nutrients available for those calves to meet that increased growth demands. If we don't have the energy or protein present for that muscle growth, we aren't going to see those returns. And I'd highly suggest consulting with either a veterinarian, nutritionist, or production expert that is familiar with your operation and production goals to help you determine your optimal implant strategy. Because as I said, they can be very complicated, so we want to make sure you get the best bang for your buck. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out or ask them in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christine. So I'm going to introduce our final speaker. Dr. Brian Warr is originally from Georgia, and after graduating with his doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Georgia, he came to Alberta, where he worked for Feedlot Health and Management Services and Zoetis Canada before landing at Veterinary AgriHealth Services. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Warr.
Good evening, and hope you're with me there. Sydney, let me know if you can't, I guess, but thank you for having me tonight. I'm very, very honored to be part of this talk and really enjoyed Danielle and Christine's presentations there. So the title of the talk I had tonight was Backgrounding, Is It the Right Choice for Your Operation? And the agenda topics I wanted to hit on was think of feed first, decision-making process for your operation if you're deciding to background or not, how to manage your risk, and finally I want to spend a little time talking about making sure you're picking low-hanging fruit that might be available to your operation. So as I was driving around and thinking about this presentation and what to talk about, I remembered when I was a student extern in West Point, Mississippi, had a backgrounding an order buyer operation, and they kept saying, you got to go spend some time with Dr. Hazard. So they gave me his number, and I called Dr. Hazard, and he said, meet me at such and such parking lot at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. I went, and I was like, I wonder how I'm going to know who this guy is. In a little bit, this guy drove up in an old Dodge pickup and just barely holding together. And I jumped in with him, wondering if we'd make the full tour or not, and went to look at this guy's stocker cattle. Sometime in that tour, he said, the more you think about these calves as grass wrapped up in leather, the better off you'll be. And at the time, as a vet student, I was wondering, what in the world is this guy talking about? But as time has passed, I think I understand more and more that Dr. Hazard was really talking about, you've got to think about cost-effective gain first and foremost if you're going to make money in stocker or background cattle. You'll see a picture here, thoughts from an old cattleman, and that's Dr. Hazard's book. And I believe he's passed away, but I encourage you to read that book if you find that story interesting. So with that said, I mean, I think we know this, that feed is the major cost of backgrounding, but I wanted to put these graphs in, and I use the BCRC calculator to generate these graphs, and that's one reason. They're not terribly beautiful, but they're effective here at showing that if we backgrounded these calves and I set parameters that seem reasonable for the current marketplace for 30 days, feed costs would actually be 52% of the total cost of the backgrounding process. We have some other fixed costs over here. Of course, yardage will go up as we keep the cattle longer, but our vet med cost is fairly fixed. Our death loss, I set at 1.5%. Our marketing cost is set at $10, but all those things together are less than half of our cost. Now, if we kept those cattle longer, and for this example, I went to 90 days, those flat or fixed costs like marketing, and I kept our death loss at the same percent, at 1.5%, which could be a little high, you might argue. But all of those things become a smaller piece of the pie, and feed cost becomes an even bigger piece of the pie. And I think this is what Dr. Hazard was trying to get me to think about that morning. So with that said, I wanted to spend just a little time because I think this BCRC calculator is extremely powerful. And hold with me because I'm going to just actually jump over to a spreadsheet. So if you go to the Google and type in BCRC preconditioning backgrounding calculator, or you can go to the tools that Sydney showed you at the beginning on the BCRC website, you can download this exact spreadsheet. And that would be my goal for you tonight. So 2 things I've mentioned so far. One, maybe buy Dr. Hazard's book. The second one that would be free is to actually go into BCRC calculator and download this and use it for your operation. So if you download it, it starts at the beginning. You have general information, and you're just going to put in anything in yellow is what you put in for your operation. So if I lived in Quebec, I'd pick Quebec from the drop down, but I live in Alberta, so I picked Alberta. You can put in your weaning date, your weaning weight. So that's kind of the general information. And then this helps also from the preconditioning side. If you're deciding if you're going to keep your own calves, you could put in, what are my calves worth today? So marketing time, use the percent shrink here. We could change that if we wanted to 4%, hit enter. And then that 550 pound calf now is pay weights 528. It did that math for me. It shows me I could put in, I think he's worth 207 a day, but the market came down a little bit now. So now he's worth 204. So my gross revenue, if I sold him, is 1,077. So it's doing that math for me. Then I can come to step 3, and I can actually put in backgrounding information. And these are the days, the duration that I'm going to feed. So I could change those. I can put in my average daily gain. You can also check this little guy here. It's kind of cool. You can do that. And it'll actually set, you just put this one in and it changes everybody in the row if you want to do all the same. Go down, you can put in your preconditioning costs. So we could do our feed cost, right? It's $2.60, probably pretty accurate. Maybe I found some cheap feed, now it's $2. I can change all those parameters. And then it kicks out these pie graphs that you can look at. But what's really cool is that it uses 5 years historical data. BCRC just updated this. You can look at whatever the recent month is, and it'll adjust based on the weight gain at those various, so they weigh more the longer I keep them, of course. If I got them up to 913, and it does math, and it can generate my background in gross revenue. And then it gives me some fancy graphs here to show my net return. Extremely powerful tool, and I think it's really cool that BCRC has made this thing available to us as producers. So that is important that you see how that worked, and I wanted to spend a little time on it because I used that calculator to do some analysis here on this, really looking at this feed cost. Quickly, I just made some assumptions. I said these cattle are going to gain 1.8 pounds a day. I was, a little pessimistic. I said they're going to have a 1.5% death loss, and I'm going to feed them for 90 days. I'm going to have a 550 pound calf at purchase, and I'm going to sell him at 712 pounds. And I had some set parameters on shrink. So those are the parameters I used for this 90-day model. And then what I did was I went and put in different daily feed costs into the BCRC calculator. So on the horizontal axis at the bottom of the page, I've got if it costs me $1 a day for that 1.8 pounds a day gain, the total net return on the vertical axis would be just less than $100 per head. But if that feed cost goes up by 50 cents a day, I'm down to $50 a day over that 90-day feeding period. $2 is a break even, right? I should have just sat in my house and kept my pajamas on and ate my cereal, because getting out there to feed every morning wasn't quite worth it. But now it's getting worse when my feed cost per day goes more than that $2 a day. It's just an example. Your parameters will be different. But I want you to think about how you might go into that calculator and use my different daily feed cost and the different average daily gain and different parameters to see if backgrounding is the right choice for your operation. So 2 things are really driving that profitability, and their gain and duration, right? So and cost of gain is what I should say, and duration of feeding. So if we gained 1.8 pounds a day and it costs us $1.75 a day to feed them, if we feed for 30 days, our net return is only $2.73. But since I'm in a positive feeding margin, keep them longer is more profitable. But if I could achieve more gain and not butterball, to Christine's point, then my economics look even better in this model. Just to demonstrate the point, I went from 1.8 to 2.2 pounds a day with the same daily feed cost, and we see that increases my revenue from the backgrounding operation. Just examples of how you might use the tool to analyze if it's the right decision for you to background. A few big take homes. If you're keeping your own calves, I think you really have to ask yourself, would I actually buy these calves to background them today? Would that make economic sense? And if the answer is no, I think you need to think about selling your calves. Backgrounding at the end of the day is the net return from it's the added value minus the additional cost. And lots of times when we're backgrounding cattle, I think we think about, all of the other value adds, like the reduced health risk for where we're selling them to, the uniformity in the group, and all of those things are important and they are valuable and they do add value. But the primary result of our value is weight gain, pounds win. So you need to make sure you're achieving cost-effective weight gain. Know that true cost. This is not a one-size-fits-all decision when I was really thinking about it. And what I want for you to do is really think about how can I make backgrounding be something that makes my operation better. And I remember a friend of mine that was giving a presentation on backgrounding, and he said, "Hey, Brian, can you send me a picture of your hay truck?" And I didn't know what he was up to. So I sent him a picture of my old 1977 GMC bale truck. Had my dogs on the back. And, that was actually my entire infrastructure, was that truck for bale feeding cows. And I guess maybe I had a pitchfork, but really I had very little infrastructure. So for me to background cattle with a full-time job and doing this on the side by myself was not very practical. On the other hand, he has a feed truck and silage and quite a bit more infrastructure, hired hands. And actually what worked well for me is that I could background my calves in his operation and also package them with his calves. And that type scenario worked very well. But at the end of the day, it's not a one-size-fits-all decision. And I think I would really like for you to go home, if you're already at home tonight, to sit down and think about what makes you unique and what gives you opportunities in your operation. And there's this thing called a SWOT analysis that we see discussed in different arenas. The SWOT analysis, let's move that in case it's blocking you, looks at your strengths, your weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. And when we're talking about these strengths and weaknesses, these are things that are internal to you or your operation. So I listed some examples of things that maybe I wish were my strengths: attention to detail, animal health. Maybe I have a great animal health background. I wish I was a great market speculator. All of these would be great strengths to have. Weaknesses: limited labor available, maybe attention in your operations divided with other responsibilities. Maybe you've never done this before and you have limited experiences and you need to seek mentorship. This bottom row, opportunities and threats, these are things that are more external to your operation. So opportunities for your area, it might be that you have cheap alternative feeds. You might have local calves available for purchase. Maybe you have feedlots in the area that are looking to purchase backgrounding calves, and you can create an alliance or a partnership there. Threats, now we always list global pandemic or foreign animal diseases. We've seen times when cattle can't move and you have to figure out how you're going to feed those cattle. Also things like currency risk and inflation, which are hot topics in the current period. But if those methods, if a logical or sitting down and really working through your decision-making process doesn't appeal to you, you can try the other alternatives. You could have a fortune teller, or you could have a crystal ball. Maybe you want to have the magic 8-ball here that says outlook not so good. Or I think what we mostly do is go to the coffee shop or somebody's basement where we have coffee, and I'll decide or discuss, what we should do with our cattle and if backgrounding is a good decision. And I find we spend lots of time talking and wondering and asking. And usually when we sit down and list and put things in a spreadsheet, things make a lot more sense. And of course, I'm being just making a joke with this, but that's my encouragement to you, is to spend the time sitting down and being very deliberate about this decision process and how you're going to find opportunities for your operation. The next points are quick, so hold with me. And I know it's getting late for most, so I'll be fairly rapid. Risk is something that I think creates anxiety for us, but at least health risk is something that I think we can manage quite well. Really appreciated Daniel's talk on that. And he drove home several times, and I think very important, we need to do whatever we can to reduce stress at weaning. And maybe you're weaning your own calves and you can reduce stress early. And we talked about the silent weans and different options that are available. But my goal or my challenge to you tonight would be to pick one thing that you can do in your operation to reduce stress at weaning. And maybe that's, or you've realized over the years that the way you sort cattle creates a lot of back and forth and a lot of piling and those things. And maybe you can do something that reduces that. Or maybe you can look at how you offload cattle that you've purchased to reduce stress at time of arrival. Good husbandry is something we can't overlook. And again, just sit and think, there's things we do the same way every year, but is there something that you can change to be better? Vaccination at branding and weaning are things that I think really prepare that immune system for the calf health challenges they're going to see in the backgrounding lot. And then I really encourage you to use that high-risk protocol if commingling or purchasing calves. And Daniel talked about that a little bit with the use of metaphylaxis and other drugs. I really like, Daniel, that you talked about checking calves, because it amazes me at the dollars of inventory that go into a pen, and in busy operations where backgrounding isn't the primary focus, checking health daily is often missed. And I encourage you to make that a priority, especially in the first 30 to 45 days on feed. And work with a veterinarian so you can head off any disasters that are on the way. Performance risk, the thing that really popped into my mind here is that guessing just isn't good enough. If I wanted to give you a goal, it'd be to figure out how to weigh your calves when they come into your operation if you're not already doing that. An accurate scale weight at time of entry is imperative for us to ever calculate what our performance actually was. Now, you might have a purchase weight and that may be good enough, but if you're weaning your own calves and we guess at their weight, we'll never know if we achieved our goals or performance. You really need to know the actual nutrient analysis of your ingredients. And the BCRC has a calculator, has a great feed sample weight analysis way to look at your feed results. Balance or ration for the desired weight gain using your nutrients from your ingredients, and work with a nutritionist to do this, and then get an accurate final weight so you know how you perform. The final risk I wanted to mention is, especially on the western half of Canada here, the livestock price insurance is available. Canadian livestock price insurance, calf price livestock. You can do it for weaning baby calves, you can do it for feeder calves, and you can do it for fats. But it's a great tool that allows you to buy a insurance premium, allows you to lock in a floor price, and still gives you the opportunity to take advantage of market upswings. So it's the past few years, I think, have proven how valuable and effective that tool can be. So I really encourage you, if it's available in your province, to look into that. Other options, of course, are US futures and contract pricing. One more slide, and I just wanted to make sure that we really talked about picking these low-hanging fruit in your operation. And Christine did a great job of talking about how cost-effective implants are. And they get there through increased average daily gain and feed efficiency. And it doesn't take long if you could achieve a 1/10 of a pound more a day, or if you can change your feed efficiency by just a little bit. These implants pay for themselves very rapidly. But most of you probably already know that, and you've already made your decision if you're going to implant or if you're not going to implant. What I would encourage you to do is, if you've decided, hey, I'm not implanting, I'm definitely okay with that. But what I want you to do is go and make sure you are acquiring market access that rewards you for not implanting. There's niches out there. We have the European Union export, different programs, and I think that you need to seek one of those programs out to get paid for not implanting. ionophores, I really encourage you to work with your nutritionist, because these are so important for you to think about from the coccidiosis standpoint, as well as from the performance standpoint. And the final one is that I see operations that do everything right. They do a great job, and then they market their cattle kind of willy-nilly, right? They go to the auction with them and hope they get a good buy, and or they even advertise them on online auction, and they use things like has had all their shots, or they even advertise sometimes they've had vaccines that are on the market. It makes me question everything I read in that advertisement. So I encourage you to spend the extra time on that marketing to make sure that you're being rewarded for the investment you put in these cattle. So my summary for the presentation I have, and I really appreciate your time, is I really encourage you to sit down and critically perform an analysis of your operation and decide if backgrounding is the right choice for you. Determine your cost of gain and analyze various scenarios. The BCRC calculator is extremely powerful. And I encourage you to look at your risk. And if you're not using it, check out that livestock price insurance. And then pick the low-hanging fruit. If there's things that are available that you're not doing, go out there and take the easy things. We don't get many handouts. So thank you very much for your time. Look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. So now we're going to open it up for questions. We have had a few trickle in. I am aware of the time, so we will just answer a couple. So I guess the first one, this one would be for Daniel. Can you speak to the efficacy of intranasal versus injectable vaccines?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, there's a few questions I noticed in the chat about intranasal vaccines. I didn't quite touch on that very much, but yeah, something like a product like Enforce 3 was brought up, which is a good 3-way viral vaccine covering against IBR, parainfluenza, and bovine respiratory syncytial virus. The good thing about it is you can actually give it to calves as young as 3 days of age. It's quite effective at installing immunity in the nose, throat, and upper airways. I think the main drawback versus the injectable is the duration of protection and also just the range of protection. You can get a little bit broader coverage with a modified live injectable vaccine. Intranasal will give you some good coverage and tend to sets up shop a little bit quicker in terms of initiating immunity. But again, it just doesn't quite last as long. Particularly the IBR component would be the first to kind of stop giving great coverage, and you're probably looking at around 3 months, roughly around that time. So questions about using it at weaning, certainly an opportunity to use it at weaning, and probably something to discuss with your veterinarian if it's a good option for you. Certainly, I think our goal with vaccines is to provide immunity before we have that stressful period, even if that means handling them before weaning. I think getting that dose of vaccine in early is going to give your best bet, but that intranasal certainly is a product to think about in your groups in terms of using at weaning too.
Thanks, Daniel. Our next question is probably going to be for Christine. Can you talk about feeding silage to lightweight calves? I think some folks don't know that small calves sometimes don't have the capacity to eat enough volume of silage to meet their requirements, as they're limited by the moisture content. I think this is really relevant with drought and everything. So
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. So I always say in general, there's 2 different sensors that tell a calf when they're full. There's one, which is going to be physical fill. So if there's lots of fiber in the diet or a lot of moisture in the diet, it's going to take up a lot more space, and there's only so much space available before those calves will quit eating. The other sensor is the energy sensor. So if there's too much energy, they'll stop eating. So it's a great point when we talk about lightweight calves and silage. There's only so much space available. So it's really important to pick the right kind of silage for you and your operation. So for those lightweight calves, if you want to feed them silage, I highly recommend something with a lot of energy, such as a corn silage with a lot of starch in it. Very important to make sure we don't have too much starch and we hit those energy sensors that are stopping them from intake, but it's a great point to always keep in mind.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm going to ask one final question, and it's going to require an answer from each of our speakers. If you could give one tip for our webinar attendees to walk away with in terms of backgrouting, whether they've been doing it for a while or are just getting into it, what tip would you like them to walk away with today?
I think you could probably guess mine. I'd like for you to go and look at that BCRC calculator and really know your numbers and spend the time looking at that. And then the other part I didn't mention, and it's actually a little scary, but still worth doing, is sometimes I save these spreadsheets when I buy when we make, even when we don't end up doing it, I save it and date it, and then I look at how accurate I actually was. So I encourage you to get that feedback loop on your projections. So.
Thanks, Brian. Daniel?
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to kind of settle on just one, but I think kind of following the topic of my conversation today is yeah, and piggybacking off of Brian, the end of his presentation would be, what can we do to reduce stress, and like particularly at the time of weaning is in this particular group of cattle and background in calves, how can we reduce the stress of separating cows and calves and kind of initiating them into this new route in their life, particularly around the time of weaning, in order just to kind of promote health and have that seamless transition as we get them onto feed.
Yeah, and from my perspective, the biggest take home is don't be afraid to ask questions and reach out to people. There's really no dumb question at all. There's great resources out there available for you, whether that's your neighbors, your nutritionists, your vets, industry reps. As long as you ask, it's not going to hurt to ask. So.
Thanks. I think that's a great note to end on there. So I want to thank everybody for participating, especially our great speakers. It's been great having you. I know I learned a lot, and yeah, much appreciation. And I hope everyone has a great evening. So thanks and goodbye.